everything happened so fast. I was like, what's so serious? You have to lock down a city of 11 million people. My parents were worried that this is going to turn into something much bigger. But obviously it was much bigger than I had even imagined.
What's up, y'all? Today we have Xinyan Yu on the channel. Xinyan's a Chinese journalist, and we work together at both Associated Press and BBC. So she's really bringing a unique perspective today because she's actually from Wuhan, where the virus originated. So we're going to talk about how that virus spread from Wuhan out throughout China and now in the US, and how that affects being a Chinese journalist in the United States right now. We're also going to talk about the US protest. So if you like this kind of discussion, please subscribe to the channel here. It just takes a second. Click the button to subscribe and click the notification bell, please. And on top of that, I'm also going to leave some time codes from our discussion right down below, so you can follow along to the parts that interest you more. Okay, thanks a lot, y'all. Let's get into it. Before we started recording, we were talking about being from Wuhan and having family there and seeing the virus move from Wuhan over to the US. So what kind of experiences have you had with that?
Yeah, so I've been working in the US for about 2 years, and when I heard about, I bought a ticket going back to Wuhan, and then I heard about the lockdown. Everything happened so fast. I couldn't believe it. I was like, what's so serious? You have to lock down a city of 11 million people. But I decided to cancel my ticket. My parents were worried that this is going to turn into something much bigger. But obviously it was much bigger than I had even imagined. And being someone here, I've been sort of in this coronavirus world since January, compared to others who's only started to realize how big it is since March. So I've seen this interesting trend. Before March, when it became a thing in the US, all the Asian Americans are facing a lot of xenophobia, a lot of racism, microaggressions. People walked up to me when I was wearing a mask, try to spit on me.
Well, yeah.
There are people who walked up to me and was like, "Are you a fucking nurse?" So it made me feel very nervous just walking around with mask. But everybody in Asia I know, or even Asian Americans in the US, normally wear a mask, and I had bought mask back in January, knowing that this is going to be something much more serious.
Of course, you saw it from the beginning.
Yeah, but the U.S. only started encouraging people to wear masks recently. So there's definitely a transition of attitude here.
Yeah, I think like with the mask situation, that was always so shocking to me because here in Thailand, everybody's wearing a mask. Like, you don't see anybody not wearing a mask. To go to 7-Eleven, you need a mask. To walk into my own building, you need a mask. And we've had minimal cases, like 3,000 total cases in a country of 65 million. I mean, not to belittle the deaths, but there's only been 57 deaths here. Compared to 100,000 in the US, it's crazy. And everybody is just full on wearing a mask all the time, even now. So I feel like there was something in the beginning in the US where like people, where it was almost like a political symbol, whether or not you were wearing a mask or not. Like you were either for opening up the market and opening up all shops or having a lockdown. There was the pro-freedom and the pro-lockdown team or something, you know?
Exactly. I think if you wear a mask, you're considered someone who is succumbing to, the government order, or especially being someone from Wuhan, I could sense that in the US, there's this sense against thinking that China was responsible for everything. And you hear from the American government that China has released the virus intentionally. There's this whole lab theory, pinning this onto the Chinese people almost. And even in the US media, there's this sort of even dehumanizing what the pandemic can do to the people in China. So people are just like, okay, this is happening to the Chinese people because of the Communist Party, because of the authoritarian rule. This will never happen to us. So there's a kind of othering going on there, that even though you can see people, the infection rate is going very fast in China, people don't see it don't see much relevance to the American people. So I think people just sort of brush it off, and now we're seeing this is more serious than what people had imagined.
Yeah, so like talk about that difference you saw between like China's reaction and the U.S. reaction, because I mean that's something that worried me because back in January, like you were saying, I was seeing videos coming out of Wuhan like a full like field hospitals and people a lot of like pretty intense scenes from the hospitals, and I was thinking like okay like we hadn't even I don't think we even had a case here, but I was like okay this looks like quite different than something else. So we already had some masks here because we had some pollution in Thailand. So we had some N95 masks already, which are pretty good. And I think that's probably why Thailand had, maybe, no one knows for sure. We're still trying to figure out the reason for Thailand. But I think that's one of the contributing factors is everybody had already in this country N95 masks from pollution. But that was just such a stark contrast to what I saw in the U.S. reaction to when the virus. I mean, I think in the U.S. everyone's thinking like, there's no way this will come here, it'll die off like SARS did. It ends there. I think in America, people are not used to like bad things happening. Do you know what I mean? It's like seems like this little bubble where everything's going to be fine and safe here, and so I feel like a lot of people were just totally unprepared for it to happen.
Yeah, totally. I think really it's interesting. I think that the mentality here is that everything that's bad that's going on in China is because of the system, and because we have a more superior system, that's not going to happen to us. But actually, there's a lot of parallel going on. When I was covering the coronavirus, the pandemic in New York City, I was talking to a lot of doctors and nurses. It's amazing. Seeing how the pain that I saw in my own hometown being replicated in New York, and nurses have been telling me that they have to repeatedly using the same PPE for weeks. And the field hospital, you see that Cuomo did that in New York City as well, and it's just interesting to see that the humanity is not so different after all.
Sure. Yeah.
And see that parallel really just sort of traumatized me twice in this whole pandemic.
Definitely. And what's the situation with your family and your parents? Everybody's fine, or how was it for them when they were under like lockdown with a city of 11 million? What is that kind of lockdown like?
The lockdown has it's definitely much more strict than the U.S. It's not. People, my family didn't leave their home for months.
For months. So what does that look like in terms of getting food and supplies?
It's all really interesting. The communities basically have like a squad. They would go buy stuff in the supermarket and then bring it to the smaller shops within the community, and then people can go pick it up, line up and pick it up. It's all very coordinated. Not in here in the U.S. I've been home basically since March, and it's very different. You can still go out, you just have to be careful. But in China, there are cases of families being forcibly separated and sent to these quarantine centers, or even in very extreme cases, people have been welded. So their door has been welded to keep them at home.
Totally. Like those are the videos that like I was like, okay, I'm gonna get a mask like now. I couldn't remember if I like verified that kind of video when I first saw it, but when I saw that video I was like, okay, time to get a mask in case. And Thailand was the first country to have a case outside of China, but I was like, okay, this looks
because of the tourists. Yeah.
So
but when you see the UK and the US, the CDC was actually actively telling people not to wear a mask. And when you see the results,
is that? Because I heard that, I think that was back in February, right? They were saying don't wear a mask, and part of me wondered, is that so that the healthcare workers can have access to the supplies, and so then it's like, well, then what part does government play into? You know what I mean?
That's one reason. Another reason I've read is that people think that this is not going to stop you from getting it. It can probably stop you from spreading it, but it may make you less vigilant in terms of social distancing. But I think the major reason is because there's already a big shortage of PPEs, and they wanted to leave it to the people who actually need it.
Yeah. Time to just start making some in high quantity, Yeah.
But then again, it's up to the government, and they should have be prepared and start purchasing all these PPE much much earlier
Yeah,
when
so,
this is all happening.
but exactly. I mean, that goes back to thinking like, people just think this wasn't going to be a big issue, and yeah. So anyway, like go back to like, so your parents dealing with the virus in Wuhan. Like, what's that like for being inside for months and really on lockdown?
Yeah, it's definitely a weird period of time. I was worried about them um, every day, and the mental status of things, and the kids going crazy. Basically, a lot of things that happened in the U.S. happened in Wuhan, and people were randomly crying out of their balcony, just singing random songs, dancing to your neighbors who are from another building. All these things happened in Wuhan, and the city is still traumatized, and there are cases like people got very sensitive to any kind of criticism on how the city dealt with it, and there's questions being asked about the numbers of death, possibly understated. Lots of chaos. The local government was held responsible. There was a doctor, his name is Li Wenliang. He was a whistleblower who sort of sent a message to his fellow doctors about wearing PPEs because it's SARS-like. And then he was sort of questioned by police, and then he later died of the infection. And that really started a movement in China on social media, a very rare one of people sort of criticizing how the government has dealt with it.
So what's I want to get into like a bit of the U.S. protests. So based on like even that, you're saying that's like a rare criticism of government. So how are you seeing that the way that the Chinese people criticize the government versus what you're seeing in the U.S. now?
That's a very complicated.
And I know it's complicated. I know it's like a loaded question because it's also totally two different kind of protests. But I also think a part of me. I mean, like this is a tragic video that everybody saw. Everybody who's seen it, it's disgusting, and everybody's shocked when they see this. Right? This is like a police murdering a man in broad daylight. That's what it is. Everybody sees that. But this protest movement, everybody has come out. And I'm not there. I just see what I see from the outside. But I think part of it also is that there's so much pent up rage and anger. 40 million people are unemployed. Where's the prospects? People think that there's a deadly virus out. Now you have systematic racism of a black man being killed by a police officer, and people are just enough and like take to the streets. Is that any accurate assessment from somebody from the outside of how it's being seen?
Yeah, so covering the U.S. The pandemic and the protests is sort of a crash course for me as an immigrant, learning about the whole history of race and the debate over racism. I've covered how African Americans are disproportionately affected in the pandemic, and the numbers are staggering. We looked into the city in Georgia called Albany, and we talked to basically how the community has lost a generation of elderlies. And it all started from funerals, and not adding to that, a lot of the essential workers who lost their jobs or got infected were from the African American community. So these factors all mixed up together, including the pent-up energy. I really don't think it's surprising that people have taken to the street, and now it's spreading all across the U.S.
Yeah, so I mean that'll be. I don't know if have we seen the numbers spike since the protest started, or it's not enough time yet.
Well, right now we're seeing. I think the numbers I've seen today is that the more than 22 states are seeing a second wave. I don't think that's just the protest. It's hard to say
because things are also opening up at the same time, right?
Exactly. They were opening up before the protest, but definitely there are second waves coming up.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see like New York and DC to see if those really have a spread. And being a Chinese American, have you felt the like the pressure of covering Corona? First of all, I mean, I know before you're talking about being spit on, like, was there like a conversation between you and other Chinese or you and other Asian Americans about a general discrimination you're feeling in America, even now or during that time?
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of evolved from when the coronavirus happened. Is mostly just microaggression, people got spat on. People.
That's more than microaggression, though, right? I mean,
Well,
that's pretty
yeah,
full on.
but then it sort of evolved, and there are cases of Asian Americans who were stabbed in Texas and shops being vandalized. And now into the protest, there was a case of Chinese American in New York City. The shop, she was actually beaten up very badly, and then her shop was all looted. I think a lot of the times the xenophobia against Asian Americans is largely neglected because normally it's microaggressions. When things more violent things happen, people tend to think it's isolated cases. And obviously the Black Lives Movement sort of overshadowed what was going on with the Asian Americans. And even in the news industry, not enough attention was given to what Asian Americans was going through during the pandemic.
Yeah, definitely. So like with that shop in New York, do you think that was targeted because she was Asian, or is that just like everybody was getting looted?
It's interesting because when we were talking to a professor, he was saying that a lot of people who are xenophobic targeted women or older people. I don't think necessarily. I mean, the anger, when you're angry, it's hard to say like who you're targeting. This may be a random case. It's hard to say, but we're definitely seeing people who are Asian Americans who are implicated in these looting and vandalism cases.
And from like an outsider now living in the States, I mean, when you see these looting protests or riots in that sense, I think they're different things. First of all, like the protest is a protest, then there's rioting, and then there's looting, and I think all three are shared, but they're also very different aspects of the movement. But when you see the looting, do you ever look at like the protests in Hong Kong and see that even though there was rioting and a lot of tough clashes with police, that there wasn't so much mayhem and disorder, that didn't happen? And as like an outsider being in America, does that, like, how do you contextualize that?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all because having covered protests in Hong Kong, peaceful protests quickly turned quite violent, especially when the police start heavily cracking down on the protest. And when vandalism happened, actually in Hong Kong, people broke into the city hall just like the people of Seattle. So there's a lot of parallel to be drawn there. But if you think about it, I mean, the debate in Hong Kong was there this attitude of no splitting. Basically, the peaceful protesters don't refrain from openly criticizing people who are more radicalized because there's a sense of unity there. And you can understand when the Hong Kong people the request that it has for the government sort of fell on deaf ears. Some would act in radical ways because they believe that they've used peaceful ways to protest and that didn't work. So I think that's sort of the theory applies to the US. This has been going on for hundreds of years. And why hasn't anything been done yet? So even though I've been seeing looting and vandalism, I understand where they're coming from. But there's also other things I've been seeing, like this really interesting idea about non-optical allyship. This is one of the words that I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one.
It's basically performative allyship. There are people who are mostly white, who are in the protests, who are doing the looting and the vandalization that were not really agreed upon by the other African American protesters. So they believe that these white Americans they join the protests sort of as a performative act, and they're doing the vandalization sort of with their own purpose instead of focusing the movement on being peaceful, on asking for equal rights. And there was this hashtag movement going on called Blackout Tuesday on Instagram, where people were sharing like black squares, but then that quickly actually affected. It actually obstructed the movement, because when you turn on Instagram, all of the Black Lives Movement material then were masked by the black squares. Right. So these performative acts actually obstructed the core movement. So there were people who were also arguing that these looting and vandalization, some done by white Americans, were a way of performative acts that act as allyship, but is not real allyship.
Nice. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think that those lootings have quieted down now, right?
Yeah.
As I've seen.
Kind of. What the Seattle City Hall.
Well, I mean,
just happened.
I don't know if okay. So like, I'll separate that kind of looting from looting of a business. That going into the city hall. I mean, that's a pretty strong act. And
it's more of a political statement.
So, and I remember the one in Hong Kong because we were there one day when they went into LegCo, and I mean that lasted into the night, and then the police cleared them out. I mean, the Seattle protests, I just saw it this morning before we talked, actually. So they're still inside from what I saw and are creating like an autonomous zone. So, I mean, I don't know. That's quite different, I think. And, I mean, they're going to be there, I guess, until they're cleared out, if they're cleared out. But and then that goes on to think about that I've seen these calls now for, defund the police, but then I've also seen abolish the police, like completely getting rid of the police force. I know that there are some people who say restructure, but I was talking to one activist 2 nights ago, and she was telling me that she was talking about totally abolishing police, and it should just be social workers and not need for police because all these things stem from lack of finances, and there wouldn't be crime or robbers if this was the case. So that there are all these elements and all different levels of the ideology in this protest movement that I found,
Yeah.
So are you seeing much of that in
Yeah, the defund the police placards were one of the most popular slogans I saw when I went to the protests in DC. It's not surprising at all. I mean, as part of my crash course on American culture, I learned that the U.S. police force were started partially to control slaves from escaping. Yeah. So and people, a lot of the news programs I've seen are sort of re-educating people on that history. I've also been watching documentaries that talk about the systematic police brutality that's very ingrained in the police system. I'm not so sure about defunding the police completely, but definitely restructuring is what's needed right now.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of countries, I think every country has police, and there's, like China has police, right? And I'm sure that's not based on racism there, so even if that is like what the beginning was for the police system, it's not what it is now, right? Or is it?
You mean China?
No, in America.
Or the U.S.?
Even if that was how the U.S. police system started. And I don't know, I read that also. But that's new information for me, which is something that is beneficial of these protests, that you look into things and you find out historical data for the way the system is.
Yeah, but there are remnants of that same idea that, this war on crimes in New York City going on, that, the more troops Bill Clinton was like using as a political movement, to a political sort of stake to bringing more police to the city, to crack down on crimes. I recently watched this documentary called Crime and Punishment, and it was about the NYPD. There were several POC police who were suing the NYPD for enforcing illegal quotas on arrests and summonses. And so this ultimately hurt the African American community, because a lot of people are arrested on very minor crimes, and they go through the system, they waste their time, and then their cases are dismissed. And all of this are done to give revenue to the NYPD and the city government.
Sure.
So
and the prison system being privatized is insane also, because it's a company you have to make profit.
There's definitely remnants of that still in the system. That's why I think that it's not surprising at all people are go to the extreme to even saying that this should be abolished.
Yeah. So I think it did get abolished in Minneapolis now. The police are abolished there, or are going to be. And like I don't really even know what that means.
Slash the funding, but not abolished.
I think they abolished. I think they abolished in Minneapolis. that is like now. I think I have to look again, but I'm pretty.
I have to.
I'm pretty sure. So let's look at that later on. But I'm pretty sure that's what I read, and I'm just like, wow, that is. I mean, I think that's quite radical. But you know, we'll see how this all goes and where it's going to evolve to. Yeah, I mean, that's something else I was thinking about with how you're saying like that the system in general is rigged, and I'm interested in this in like from a financial point and a currency place, because you also see now that like, you know, so what's happening right now? We have trillions of dollars being printed. That's the Fed printing money. You have the stock market soaring in the middle of a time where, you know, it seems like things aren't well. You know, you have like a pandemic and you have like mass protests, but the stock market's reaching all-time highs. So why is that happening? And so to me, that's just like a financial question where it's like the dollar is being devalued by printing money, so stocks are going up. And that's another way to keep lower income down, because there's no financial education. So people, first of all, can't even save money. 2/3 of Americans cannot afford, this is before the pandemic. There's a report, 2/3 of America cannot afford a $400 emergency. That's shocking. You know, how can people go? So if you can't do that, even the money that you do save, the other third, if you save actual money instead of putting it in a market or an asset, real estate, gold, crypto, then what's happening? Your dollar is also, that you're saving, is also going down. So it's just constant pressure from the system to keep people down unless they have education.
Yeah, I think the pandemic really exposed a lot of the problems that the U.S. already have. And interestingly, when covering pandemic is, like I said, is a crash course on all American problems related to race, related to, like you said, the income problem, the income inequality, unemployment, and now the race issue. Yeah. It's really interesting to see how that unfolds. But when it comes to the protests, I'm actually seeing really tangible change. I mentioned earlier that you know, there's this woman I interviewed. She did a children's book, basically teaching white children how to confront white supremacy, and she told me that she sold out thousands of copies overnight. So that's tangible results you're seeing. So hopefully we will see some transformative changes coming out of the protests. But it also makes me angry when you hear about the economy sort of recovering, and you hear about Trump making the comment that, oh, you know, the jobs, talking about the job number, and how he says that, you know, George Floyd should be happy that this is happening.
Okay, I did not see that. He said that in a tweet, or he said that in a press conference?
It was a press conference. Yeah. So there's a lot of conflicting things happening right now. Crazy time. Yeah.
So is this your first stint in America?
I was working for the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong newspaper in the U.S. So I covered a lot of China-U.S. related things, and the Hong Kong protest that happens overseas in New York, in D.C., various places.
Yeah. Cool. So how do you this podcast also, I hope that it reaches people who are like just starting or want to get into journalism. So I want to ask, like, how do you land a gig at a BBC? How does one get a job at the BBC? And what was your path, and what do you do? How does one get that job?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't realize. Well, partially is having a good mentor, someone who really, really believes in you. You and I worked in the same newsroom, and I had Jerry, who really, really believed in my capabilities. So he introduced me to the bureau chief of our Asia Pacific bureau back then, and he gave me 3 months time to try out, and I was able to get my foot into the door, even though I had no real previous experience.
So how did you meet Jerry?
AP had a great global news internship program that they had 20 people internationally and 20 people in the U.S. every year, and it's funded. You're paid basically to do a rotation on 3 different desks: photo, video, text. So I got to send I was lucky. Actually, I didn't do so well in the interview. I was told later by
Really?
the viewer who interviewed me,
That's
"You're
funny.
the best, but you sounded like you had the most potential." There are people who did much
That's
better than
funny.
me, but
That's funny they said that too.
they were hoping to find someone who they can shape from a very early stage. So I was lucky to be chosen to participate in the program, but I was able to prove that even though I don't come from, I've never worked in Thailand before, I was able to deliver what was asked of me in the newsroom. And then later on, after I joined the BBC, I went back to Thailand and to cover international news. So that's something that it's really important to me, having that international perspective from the very beginning.
So talk a bit about that, like getting that internship, and then how one thing leads to the next.
Yeah, so I think what really helped me with the internship, not only just that I was lucky, but also that I was preparing for it with I did an internship before that with the Jakarta Post. So I was able to, again, like use that experience to show them that I was able to cover an environment, a country that I wasn't so familiar with, and I was able to write long features about topics I wasn't familiar with. I think that's a capability that all journalists need, and I think that's why they saw potential in me. And that really helped me.
And then from there, how did you hear about? Because you went on from AP to BBC. So how did you find out about the BBC job, and what was that process like to get that?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I think when I was at AP, I really I think having someone who is a mentor to you, who really believes in your capability, is very important. So Jerry, my boss on the video team, introduced me to Joe Floto, who was heading the bureau in Beijing back then. So when he was visiting the Bangkok bureau, I went to meet him, and he gave me a chance to try out. And during that time, there was a big political meeting happening in Beijing, so he really needed people. So I was able to join the BBC on a freelance base at the beginning.
Okay, so you got a freelance position with them, and then how long was that? And then they opened up they said, hey, we're going to keep you on, or there was a job that you applied for, or where did that lead to?
So that was 2012, when China was just becoming quite important in the international arena. We really needed people back then, so they created a position for me, which I was also very lucky for. I stayed with the BBC for 6 years, and then I decided, BBC is such a big ship. I've sort of known the China operation a lot. There's a lot of restriction for Chinese nationals working inside China for foreign media. So I decided to sort of change course and see what the outside world is like. And back then, that was when South China Morning Post was bought by Alibaba, and they had a lot of investment to expand their new media, expand their video production capacity. So I thought that was a good opportunity. So I took the job, and then started this. I was one of the people who founded this app called Inkstone News, and it was covering China-U.S. relations, and I was doing video and text together.
You're saying that so nonchalantly. So you also founded this app? I didn't know that with Inkstone. I always saw your stuff in Inkstone. I didn't know you were part of founding that.
Well, I was part of the founding team.
That's awesome.
Actually, Juliana Leo, who was also BBC. Yeah. She basically established the team with a lot of BBC people.
Cool.
So the team really
and you were doing like a lot of really cool video with that project.
Yeah, so it allowed me I had a lot of freedom with the project. I write a lot, and I did a lot of videos for them, which is really great. Yeah. And then very quickly, I learned that there was opportunity opening in the US, so I decided to transfer here. And I actually started the South China Morning Post's video production in New York. I hired an associate producer to work with me. I was able to do more short films than just newsy pieces. This is the right time to be here as a Chinese journalist because of what's going on with the China-U.S. relations. Everything is, the U.S. is looking inward, and journalists are being expelled, and Chinese journalists are getting visa restrictions. So this is really the time that we really need good reporting on the ground. But I've sort of shifted gears again. Now I'm covering only U.S. news, but still watching very closely what's going on with U.S.-China. relations.
Right, and then after that, now you've come back to join BBC. So I mean, this is what's interesting about like the path of career progression is that, you know, in the beginning you would not see where you are now because it's impossible to see, but you just followed one stone, one step to the next, and now you're back in the States, and you're running the Cut Through the Noise right now with BBC, right?
I'm one of the producers.
Cool. So which is now like the social media platform, BBC. It's primarily on Facebook, right? Is it anywhere else?
It's only on Facebook,
right? Yeah, that's what I thought.
But we normally repurpose the show for the web as well. It's targeting younger audiences in the U.S. who are interested in cutting through the noise because there's a lot of breaking news happening. So we're trying to understand exactly. It's interesting because when I was working in Beijing in the BBC bureau, I've applied for. I was thinking about getting an attachment in Washington D.C. because I was really interested in sort of expanding my skill set. I don't want to just be focused on China, but I wasn't able to do it. But like you said, I think with my eyes looking at this covering the U.S., I was able to do it with other organizations, and now eventually I arrived at what I wanted to do.
That's awesome.
Earlier.
Cool. That's awesome. You mentioned that in China now the people were being thrown out. So who was? I think it was like Washington Post. Am I wrong about that? And New York Times, and there was one other.
Yep. CNN. CNN.
Really?
Yes. Oh, CNN. Actually, sorry. CNN is their local staff.
Oh, wow.
The Chinese staff who were forced to resign. So that's another layer of things that people don't really know.
Right. So talk about that also, like how it is to be a Chinese journalist in China, and how it's like labeled by the government.
It's very hard time to be Chinese journalist right now. So back in China, the law now requires that all the Chinese nationals working for foreign media can only be labeled as assistants or researchers. So basically, you don't have bylines. You don't get to go on air. You don't get to go on radio programs or anything. You're basically behind the scene.
Right.
So there's a lot of limitation to what you can do. So when the tit for tat, U.S.-China retaliation happened, when several U.S. journalists were expelled from China, what wasn't widely known was a few Chinese nationals working for various U.S. outlets were also forced to resign. But then again, for them, a lot more is at stake, so they couldn't really speak up. So as Chinese journalists based overseas,
and what do you mean a lot more is at stake? Like family-wise, societal, or what?
Various things. They have families there, and they still have a career there. And if they do anything, that would jeopardize their future career. If they go on to work for another foreign media, they will still have to apply for a press card. And if they have said anything that's upset the government, the chance of them not getting it is very high. So a lot more is at stake for them. They can't just escape to another place to do journalism.
So talk about that, because that's like a very probably foreign concept for Americans watching. That if you say something out of line, that, like you say, your press credentials will be rejected. Is that right? Or how does it work there?
There's always a risk. So for the Chinese nationals working for foreign media, we're not allowed to publicly say anything or even have a proper byline. When I was at BBC, I wasn't able, even if I did anything, I led some of the research. I wasn't able to even put my name on the reporting. And that is true with the majority of the foreign press in China. So that greatly limited what we could do. And now it's only becoming worse, the media environment.
And so what's the media coverage from like Chinese media on the protests in the U.S.? Because the reason I'm asking is because I was thinking about what the U.S. narrative was on Hong Kong. They're like, yes, everybody, at least from U.S. politicians, we support the Hong Kong people, we support the protest. And now you have a major protest movement in the U.S. that's building momentum. So what's the other side? How is China looking back on the current protests, and also like referencing Hong Kong in there, or are they?
It's very funny because the Chinese government is basically having such a party right now because the U.S. is basically giving them ammunition in terms of propaganda because they're like, look, you glorified protests in Hong Kong and calling it, a beautiful scenery, quote unquote. Right now that's happening in your country and you're being a hypocrite not supporting it right now. So you are seeing Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the spokesperson was like tweeting things like I can't breathe or Black Lives, all lives matter. That's really rare. I've never seen that before. And it was quite funny that China has sort of turned that around as their own propaganda. In terms of what's going on in Hong Kong. Right now there's a controversial national security law happening in Hong Kong, and that's sparking new protests. So that this is kind of an interesting time that China's using that to sort of spin the narrative.
How are Asian Americans caught up in the Black Lives Matter movement?
I've seen lots of people who came out to support Black Lives Movement. There's this phrase called something like Asian silence. Normally Asians don't really speak up, but there's definitely a movement within the Asian American community to sort of encourage people to speak out more. But you also see voices criticizing one or two, there's conflicting report, but one or two of the police who were involved in George Floyd's death were Asian. So that has become a controversial point as well. And I've also seen, I think this is Korean American lady on social media who was saying that, where were you when Asian Americans were being targeted by bigotry, suffering from bigotry. And now you're asking us to speak up for you. So there's a lot of sentiment going on right now. And there's also, I've seen reports that some of the looting and vandalization has targeted Asian owned businesses. So I just wanted to look into that and put that into perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And when you mentioned the Asian discrimination, is that like in general always, or specifically because of COVID this year, or COVID amplified?
It's definitely the xenophobia against Asian American has always been there. It has hundreds of years history as well. The Japanese immigrants, the encampment of Japanese immigrants, the Chinese immigrants who were building the railway in California, who were basically erased from that history. So that, like the Black Lives Movement, Matter movement, the Asians also feel like they've been erased from the history. But the pandemic has definitely heightened the tension. Actually, the BBC has done some just basically looking through the media reports to see coronavirus-related Asian bigotry targeted Asians. We've seen over 100 since March cases. These are the cases that, and half of them are brought to the police. So they're serious enough to be reported to the police. So definitely there is heightened tension and heightened xenophobia against Asian Americans. Yeah. But it's not a new thing.
Yeah. Seems like coronavirus exposed everything in the world.
Definitely. In
every category,
every
and everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely in the US.
Cool, Xinyan. So good luck on the next few weeks, and hopefully it's coming up to peaceful times. I don't know. Let's see what happens. But 2020 has been a ride so far in May, or it's June right now.
Yeah.
It's freaking beginning of June.
Yeah, I cannot believe it. Time has passed so quickly. I cannot believe it's been 6 months already. Before I first learned about this thing called coronavirus.
It's a crazy year. I started this year from Australia and the wildfires, actually. Like right after I got off my winter holiday in Miami, I was in Russia, and Imelda asked me to fly to Australia. So I was in Russia for the layover back to Bangkok. I took one night in Bangkok and then back over to Australia, and then it's been crazy since then. So
awesome, amazing! You're being deployed to all these places. Well, that's really nice. That's what I missed about my previous job.
Deployments.
Being able to cover. Yeah. Now not so.
But
much.
You're traveling within America, or it's mostly in DC or what?
Yeah. But I literally went into quarantine 2 weeks after I started. So I've been desk bound for months now.
Right. Right.
It's also a lot more expensive to travel now, and all the media are slashing their budget. It's a difficult time for U.S. media as well. Coors has laid off many staff. Vice has laid off many staff. It's been very depressing for the media industry here.
Yeah, I've seen that. So hope it all reverses for everybody, and everybody has their good opportunity, their good stake. Try to be an optimist, you know.
What I feel good about being here in the U.S. is that the community is very resilient. So you've seen thousands of emergency funds and people helping each other, and even during the pandemic, the media really played a great role in sort of looking past the misinformation, the disinformation. It's a really important time to support the media industry now. What
was the biggest like disinformation or correction that you guys had to put out, you think?
For us, I don't think we have. We haven't. Oh, you mean for correcting other people's
I mean that like you see like a disinformation campaign going out, and maybe they're, you know, the media put a.
Oh, there's this really popular show that went out on Telegram called Plandemic, and it was basically all conspiracy theory, and there's millions of people.
Yeah.
Exactly, who watched it, and you just cannot believe how popular that was. So definitely the space is filled with misinformation, and that's fueled by fear, and you know, media, one of the roles that media play is to sort of give reasoning and tell people what's going on.
You know, I saw this I saw this meme in one of like the cameraman Facebook groups I'm in, but they had one about Plandemic, and the guys just said, this just shows the power of a well-lit interview. Because if you've seen Plandemic, it's like the lighting of the interviews look beautiful, it's stunning, and then everybody is like believing the story behind it because it looks so professional, the lighting. So that was like the main
right.
This is a perfect example of why you must light an interview well, you know. And it's true. You know, you make it look nice, and you can make people. It's easier to persuade an opinion, and I think this is the challenge that a lot of media is facing now, to like combat everything, you know, like you said before, like why cut through the noise is important, because there's just so much.
Yeah.
There's so much for people to read, be misled, look at, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly.
Crazy times. Cool. Okay, Xinyan, thanks a lot. This has been fun.
Thank you, Danny, for having me.